unapologetic women. It's a topic that's central to my own life, my own aspirations, my work. And when the event organizers asked me for something I was unapologetic about, I kind of, without giving it a whole lot of thought, said, well, my hair is getting gray. I'm my graying hair. And then I was really worried when I saw the promotional picture because it doesn't really show you the part of my hair that's getting gray. So it is getting gray. Just I wore it back because then you can see it more. And I think it's okay. You know, I'm almost 51, so. And I chose my graying hair as something I'm unapologetic about, I think because it represents change in my life. The movement through middle age, and also because graying hair represents something I can't control, right? I suppose I could color it, and I just honestly have never been able to go there. It sounds like more trouble than it's worth. I don't have a problem with women coloring their hair, but for me it just is not my lifestyle. So, and even if I did, it probably wouldn't stop. Underneath it's still graying, and that's something that I can't control. And I think making peace with those parts of our lives that maybe we don't have control over, making peace with those parts of our lives that are in change, those parts of our lives that are uncertain or evolving, the supposed imperfections in our lives, the supposed imperfections in our bodies, that's a key part of becoming unapologetic. And I say that not because I've arrived. I assure you, I have not. I'm still very much in the process of making peace with uncertainty in my life, with change in my life, with things I can't control. But I know the direction I want to go in, and it has a name, and it's unapologetic. So I chose for a title for these brief comments, The Violence of Perfection, because I think beneath so many women's apologetic feelings about themselves, feelings that we've done something wrong, even when we haven't, feelings of inadequacy and self-loathing, feelings of shame. Beneath those feelings, I think there's some notion of perfection that we're not living up to. Whether it's the idea of being a perfect mother, a perfect career woman, or having a perfect body, we torture ourselves with some idealized image of who we're supposed to be and who we're constantly failing to be. Okay, so how can we stop apologizing for not being perfect? Because when it comes right down to it, when you think about all this apologetic impulses we have, so much of it is rooted in this notion that we're supposed to be somehow more perfect. And I think to get at that question, we have to ask, what is perfection anyway? And perhaps even more importantly, who decides? Now, my work as a feminist scholar of religion has focused a lot on women's relationships with their bodies. So that's where I'm going to focus my critique today of this harmful myth of perfection that keeps us perpetually apologizing, even when we've done nothing wrong. Now, but if body image is not a problem for you, and maybe there's one or two of you in here who have never experienced body image issues, transfer and translate my comments perhaps to whatever area in your life that you feel apologetic energy about. When you study the history of religion, it becomes apparent really quickly just how frequently women's bodies are viewed in negative terms. They're associated with sin, with impurity, with desire, temptation, decay, unpredictability, and death. Of course, these views of women's bodies are ones we get from male theologians. They're not women's self-descriptions. And what the male theologians, in particular, a lot of my research is focused primarily on Christianity because that's the tradition I come from, and I always find it a little bit awful to be critical about somebody else's tradition when you've got lots of stuff you could be critiquing in your own. It's also the tradition that's most influenced the culture I grew up in. But when you look at these views of the male theologians, really from the very early centuries of Christianity, what they really feared about women's bodies was their capacity for change. And now this capacity for change was signaled in processes like menstruation, or pregnancy, or lactation, menopause. Some of these processes probably a lot of us are familiar with, right? And in contrast to the men's theories of spiritual perfections, women's bodies seemed horribly out of control. This negative view of women's bodies may seem like a relic of the past, but it's part of our collective history, and it continues to influence us. And I think it continues to influence our conflicted relationships with our bodies, and the way we constantly feel this sense of apology about our bodies not being good enough, about not being perfect enough, about something being wrong with them. The influence is indirect, but I think it's there. In many ways, I'd say contemporary images of supposedly perfect or good bodies recycle that religious legacy that sees women's bodies as shameful, as inferior, as in need of correction or control. So I think to really challenge the way that this legacy has become internalized in ourselves, in our own psyches, in our collective unconscious, in the culture, we need to look at some of the images and the violence that they encourage us to have toward our own bodies, and the aggression that they encourage us to have towards ourselves. So now, when I'm talking to my students and we're talking about these issues, one of the things that they say is, I know that all of those images of perfection, I know that they're airbrushed, I know they're not real, I know that they're photoshopped and stuff, but I still can't get those images out of my head. And I think part of the thing is that we can cerebrally critique them, but they become so habitual in our psyche that we really need to take some time and look at them critically. So in my book, The Religion of Thinness, one of the tools that I recommend for dealing with this internalized sense of perfection that we're forever failing to live up to is cultural criticism. So I thought it might be a little fun for us to practice a little cultural criticism today. And I'd like to take a few minutes to look at some of the images, I think, that give us an idea of perfection, that teach us and encourage us to react to our own bodies in a kind of aggressive manner. Now, I apologize a little bit to Health Magazine because I just picked on it for simplicity's sake. It's okay to apologize?
No.
No? Oh, no, I don't have to apologize. See, there you go. Okay. I'm actually not going to apologize because I think one of the things that Health Magazine does is it fosters a pretty unhealthy relationship with our bodies. I'm not saying there aren't good articles in there, but when you look at some of these images, even the language itself is very violent. Banish belly fat, right? Now, first of all, we need fat on our bodies if we're going to give birth. Right? And a lot of the place where that fat ends up landing and often staying is in our bellies. So this idea that we have to kind of go to war with our bodies to be healthy strikes me as really unhealthy. And then, I love this one, erase the years off your face. Anybody got an eraser and I could maybe just start, I mean, it's crazy. And one of the things I like to do when I'm with my students is do this kind of critique collectively, because often when we look at these kinds of images, whether it's, I don't know what kind of magazines you read, maybe you don't read Health Magazine, maybe it's Glamour or Vogue or whatever, a lot of times we're doing it as entertainment, not realizing that we're getting an education. We're getting an education. We might as well be reading a textbook, except that these are more powerful because they're more fun. And we don't realize that oftentimes the pleasure we're getting from them has many messages embedded in it. And the messages are not necessarily making us feel good about ourselves. They're teaching us to apologize. So we will just look at a few of these. I think I have 6 slides. One of the things you'll notice is just how monotone the messages are. And this is true for Health Magazine. Always in the left-hand upper corner, the first big message is that to be healthy, you have to be thin. Well, if you're born to be thin, maybe, but what if you're born with a larger body? What if you have hereditary genes in you that predispose you to be larger? Okay, here we go with the burn fat fast again. And again, I want you to just pay attention to the language itself and the antagonistic relationship that this language encourages you to have toward your body. This one I think is interesting because of the message about cancer here. And obviously we want to do whatever we can to prevent cancer, but can we really stop it? Does that mean somehow if you got cancer it's your fault? right? So some of these messages suggest and encourage us to believe that we can actually really be in control of our bodies. And perhaps a more helpful way to approach health is to understand that we have a responsibility to do our best, but we don't have total control. And there's a difference between influence and control in relation to our bodies, right? And that control stuff, I think, really fuels that sense of apologizing, because then if we don't control, as we're supposedly supposed to, then we have failed. Then we need to apologize. So one of the messages that I wanted us to think about is part of the reason I love focusing on the body and our relationship to the body is because I think how we relate to our bodies is very much related to how we relate to others and how we relate to life. So a lot of times when I'm talking to groups of people, especially with parents in the audience, they'll say, well, what can I do for my daughters? You know, what I want to make sure that my daughter grows up with a healthy body image. And I said, you got to start with yourself. And if we're having an antagonistic relationship with our own body, feeling apologetic, feeling shameful, feeling like it's never going to be good enough, feeling self-loathing, that gets communicated. And not only that, but to the extent that we shame and judge ourselves and our own bodies for not living up to that perfect ideal, in many ways, we're creating a habit of shaming and judging others. We may not know it, but we are. We can't judge ourselves by a different yardstick than we judge others. So one way to create a more compassionate world is to start loving our bodies as they are, right? So I think the next slide is some strategies. Oh yeah, some nonviolent strategies to shift the paradigm from a violent relationship toward your body, an aggressive relationship, a shaming relationship toward your body, to a nonviolent relationship with your body. So I'm going to get a little bit, I'm a religion professor, so I hope you don't care. I'm going to get a little spiritual on you. I think these suggestions are spiritual. Not necessarily religious, although they may sync with your religious beliefs, but I think they're spiritual ones, and they start with appreciating diversity. I don't know if you noticed even those 6 magazine covers that I relatively randomly found on the web, they're all white, right? So the message that we get is beauty is white. Beauty is thin, beauty is wealth, beauty is able-bodiedness. And to the extent that we train ourselves to see beauty and health in those very narrow terms, we're not only not learning to love the parts of ourselves that don't fit that ideal, but we're also cultivating a way of looking at others with a kind of one-size-fits-all, one-color-fits-all point of view. So loving diversity is not about political correctness. It's about being at peace with yourself and contributing to a more peaceful world by seeing beauty in diversity. Why should we all be the same size or the same color or the same ability? How do we practice radical acceptance of the things we don't like, right? Of the things that are hard for us. They may not even relate to our bodies. We've all got stuff that's really hard. But all of the spiritual teachings from every tradition say the same thing, that if you can't accept it, if you can't let it go, you're going to cause suffering to yourself and to other people. So acceptance is fundamental for that kind of transformation we're looking for. And then, of course, the struggle for justice. Just because we need to learn to accept ourselves, accept diversity, love that, doesn't mean that we should tolerate injustice. That's a fundamental part of health for ourselves, for others, and for the world. And part of that involves seeing the interdependence of life, right? If somebody else is suffering, that's my pain too, and I need to care. And I need to find a way to work on making the world a better place by working on myself and seeing them as an interdependent process. Sometimes I really can focus more on the suffering of others, and sometimes I got to really focus on dealing with my own suffering, but they're interdependent. And the good news about that is there's always something you can do. Finding strength and vulnerability, I probably don't need to tell you that much about that, but I think we've often adopted this idea that being strong and tough means being stoic and being kind of on top of things, being in control. It's that same control paradigm we use to relate to our bodies, and then we use that same energy thinking we need to be in control in our lives. And a lot of times there's a lot more power from just admitting that this is really hard. And I haven't got it all figured out, and I'm still very much a work in process, and it's okay. And then a final one is, this one relates to my gray hair, I think, embracing impermanence, right? One of the first principles in Buddhism is that life is constantly changing. And we suffer because we just don't want it to. We want to hold on. And sometimes when we're in a really bad situation or a hard situation, we want it to change really fast, and it can't change fast enough. But most of the time, it's difficult because we want to hold on. We don't want things to change. And so that causes a lot of suffering. But the more we can move through life with a kind of non-resistant attitude towards the changes, towards the things we can't control, perhaps the more we can stop apologizing for not being perfect.